Okay, good evening from Athens, and welcome to the very first IPT talk for this year, this academic year 2024-2025. It's a great honor for us that we are opening this session, this academic session, with Professor Sorgner about the issue of transhumanism. And just to say only a few words about Stefan, he's a philosophy professor at John Cabot University in Rome. He's co-founder of the Beyond Humanism Network and fellow at the Institute of Ethics and Emerging Technology, a research fellow at the University of Seoul, and also visiting Professor Argenta. And he's a prolific academic author with many articles and books, and a leading figure in the philosophy, first of all, of Nietzsche, and also the philosophy of emerging technologies, and particularly transhumanism. And for the Greek audience, we have some news also to underline that it's going to be one of his book, The Philosophy of Post-Human Art, translated in modern Greek. So, Stefan, welcome to our institute, and thank you very much for your talk today. And the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot for this kind introduction. Yes, I'm very happy. I'm thrilled to say that my book, Philosophy of Post-Human Art, is coming out in Greek translation soon, and it actually has got a lot of Greek resonances. So I particularly draw upon the thought of Heraclitus, and sort of the entire framing of the book is such that it is very Heraclitean. Yes. And because I think the post-human paradigm shift it could be described as a way to move from sort of a Platonic ontological categorical dualism towards a Heraclitean flux. And basically, this is what is taken seriously and considered seriously as part of that book, and with respect to the arts, with respect to the post-human arts. And that also reveals already that sort of what my specific take on transhumanism is. So transhumanism is normally something which had a strong basis in the Anglo-American world. It was founded, the term was coined by Julian Huxley in 1951. The word was created originally by Dante, but that had a completely different meaning. And the word transhumanism, even before Julian Huxley, was used, but in a metaphysical sense, in an afterworldly sense. So it's a completely different meaning. But Julian Huxley coined the term transhumanism, and then afterwards, sort of in the 90s, it was developed further by people by Max More, Natasha Vita More, FM 2030. They sort of were responsible in shaping the contemporary meaning of the term transhuman. And then at the end of the 90s, in Oxford, with many scholars in the Anglo-American world, they basically brought about the notion. They brought about what can be associated, what can be described as classical transhumanism, because many contemporary scholars, many other authors have strongly reacted to that type of approach. And whenever people think about transhumanism, they usually associate it with that type of classical transhumanism, which is strongly embedded in the Anglo-American world. And then in 2009, I published a paper on Nietzsche and transhumanism, and that's actually become one of the most cited Nietzsche papers ever written. So I was very happy about that. But on that basis, on the basis of that paper, I was relating, because I had sympathies for a transhumanist approach, but basically all this utilitarianism, all this utopian thinking, which was embraced as part of this classical transhumanism, didn't resonate with me. It just didn't make any sense. So as a consequence, I tried to, inspired by Heraclitus, by Nietzsche, by people like Spinoza, develop these way of thinking further, the basic insights of transhumanism further, and in particular in the books on transhumanism, We've Always Been Cyborgs and Philosophy of Post-Human Art, I developed sort of a philosophy of Euro-transhumanism, and that is that has resonated strongly with quite a few people, with intellectuals, artists, and entrepreneurs who've started to engage with it. And now I'm developing this notion further and working on a manuscript on another book publication dedicated to Euro-transhumanism in order to highlight, well, it's not just about mind uploading, it's not just about reaching immortality. It is something which is much more realistic and can be properly justified. So what I'm trying to do here now, after having presented sort of basic outline um, of what the cultural embeddedness of that entire story, so I'm presenting in a nutshell the following 12 differences between classic transhumanism and Euro transhumanism, and this is how they can be summarized. And just in order to highlight, well, whatever you traditionally maybe have associated with transhumanism is rather classical transhumanism, but a proper, intellectually informed, embedded in the European cultural context, because these are the thinkers which resonate with me. So on that basis, a very different kind of transhumanism can actually come about, which still affirms that it's in our interest to move beyond our boundaries, beyond our current limitations. However, the justification is an entirely different one, as well as the cultural framing, ethical understanding, and philosophical justification. So classical transhumanism, that's point number one, would be classical transhumanism upholds utopias. Euro-transhumanism rejects the affirmation of utopias. And this is I dealt with in detail, for example, in the book We've Always Been Cyborgs. I extensively dealt with the issue of utopias. And some classical transhumanists, they've seriously suggested the death of death, the goal of getting rid of suffering entirely, or a long-termist version of utilitarianism, which implies that what matters is merely that some humans have survived. Probably, the most intelligent one, the richest one. It has some highly problematic implications. But none of these issues are either realistic or desirable options. And with my German background, so I've long been confronted with challenges of utopias. And I react really strongly to them. So utopias promise a future which will never, and maybe even can never, come about, and also have the implication that the quality of lives of currently living people get sacrificed for utopian futures. And this means persons are merely being treated as a means for future which will never come about. And such structures must be avoided at all costs. And this doesn't mean that one shouldn't play around with certain visions as inspirational factors. However, it does mean that any utopia which gets taken as sole universally valid purpose has terrible implications which need to be avoided. So it's a rejection of utopias. The second point would be that classical transhumanism affirms a hyper-Renaissance ideal of perfection. Euro-transhumanism affirms a radical diversity of concepts of the good. So I dedicated an entire chapter of the monograph We've Always Been Cyborgs to this topic, in which I distinguish between hyper-humanist accounts of the good, a common sense account of the good, and a radically pluralistic account of the good. A hyper-humanist account of the good has been suggested by Bostrom. It basically implies that the Renaissance ideal gets accepted and technologies get used and to realize it, such that the traditional targets can be exceeded. Superman on Viagra, Wonder Woman on Botox. The common sense account of the good draws upon widely shared elements of the good, like not being ill, not being handicapped, and having highly developed cognitive capacities. And that has been suggested by a liberal, by a libertarian, Julian Savulescu. And it's tempting to agree with him. It's a very, very intriguing account. However, the challenges come about when the various factors are taken as ultimately justified and valid elements of the good. Then it can have strongly paternalistic implications. And I've suggested a radical diversity of concepts of the good as an alternative. It takes seriously that the bundle of tribes out of which we're all constituted doesn't have an essential core element. For increasing the likelihood of people living a good life, this diversity needs to be considered. At the same time, I stress that some factors are such that they indeed are widely shared. For example, the relevance of an increased health span. It gets acknowledged that an increased health span is not necessarily is not a necessary element for living a good life, but it's a widely shared element, which means that for most people, it's a value which increases their quality of life. But the difference between a universally valid concept and between a widely shared one is really decisive here. The third point is classical transhumanism has an optimistic worldview. Euro-transhumanism regards dukkha as plausible and consequently a version of philosophical pessimism. Some classic transhumanists claim that a world without suffering can indeed be realized, that minds can be uploaded soon, such we can experience lives full of the most wonderful types of fulfillment. And this is wishful thinking. I'm not even certain whether such visions are desirable. However, I do not regard these descriptions of the world we live in as plausible. The world can be interpreted so many ways. We can tell an enormous amount of stories to make sense of the world. I mean, story can always be retold in different manner. However, as a famous song says, some fundamental things apply as time goes by. One of the fundamental insights is the relevance of suffering of dukkha. If the ego wants something, it suffers, and there's no way escaping the fundamental structure. The challenge lies in how we deal with suffering. This insight gets acknowledged by many world religions. They provide various responses on how to deal with the permanent suffering people have to deal with. Moments of fulfillment are rare, and they're always mixed with pain. Intensely, overflowingly fulfilling moments of pleasure, pains might be the best we can hope for. These are even more special than simple moments of pleasure. Dukkha is inevitable. It needs to be acknowledged, which I've done in various publications of mine, starting from my book, actually, Metaphysics Without Truths, which came out when I was 26. The fourth point is classical transhumanism affirms the universal validity of certain values and norms, which can have neo-colonial implications. Euro-transhumanism regards perspectivism as plausible, which undermines the possibility of neo-colonial implications. Classic transhumanism has suggested so many different norms and values, and they have claimed universal validity for these normative judgment. And this is highly problematic for various reasons. And one of them is an ontological worry. How and where should any such universally valid normative judgment exist? Mackey's account of values and norms in Inventing Right and Wrong from 1990 is plausible. Objective values and norms would have to be like Plato's forms, extremely weird ontological entities in a realm which cannot be accessed by means of our senses. I agree entirely. However, if this is not the case, what then are norms and values? And they are fictive entities created in the interest of their inventors, is my reply I give in the Cyborgs books. By analyzing the underlying motives of the inventors, the relevance of the normative judgments can be grasped. If this is a plausible account of normative judgment, the issue of neocolonialism doesn't come up either, as neither norms nor values would claim their own universal validity. And this doesn't mean that autonomy needs to be given up, but the implications of a liberal ethics of fictive autonomy need to be thought through, and that's what I've done, and we've always been cyborgs. The fifth point is classical transhumanism affirms a version of utilitarianism. Euro-transhumanism embraces a hermeneutic understanding of ethics. Utilitarianism, which is so widely shared in the Anglo-American world, has enormously rigid implications. The morally right action can be calculated on the basis of a mathematical formula. Appropriate numerical values need to be connected to possible outcomes, probabilities need to be associated, and the morally right account and action can be analyzed. This way of dealing with ethical challenges might be helpful when dealing with some political issues. However, in many real-life circumstances, the particular circumstances of the situation are so nuanced that a hermeneutical procedure provides more plausible judgments. The devil is in the details. Cultural resonances, intellectual associations, and connected connotations need to be considered. Consequently, it's advisable to always progress with enormous care when dealing with ethical challenges and moral dilemmas. The sixth point is classical transhumanism argues for libertarianism. Euro-transhumanism embraces a social democratic version of liberalism. The political aspect is a particularly tricky one. I'm aware that political norms too are human-made fictions. The overall political system depends on what representative or interest groups have fought for successfully. There's not one ideal political arrangement which is the ultimate goal or which is valid for all times. Hence, various advantages and disadvantages need to be considered, whereby the question advantages and disadvantages for whom always has to be considered. When it comes to developing new pharmaceuticals, I can even see advantages of a libertarian system. However, when it comes to issues like accessibility, then the question needs to be taken seriously: in which kind of society do you want to live? A society in which people don't have access to publicly funded healthcare system seems to me highly problematic. You're not feeling well, you need to think whether you can afford to be taken to a hospital or to a physician. That's just terrible. Nation states are there to take care of the well-being of the people living in these states, and having access to a public healthcare system is such a fundamental element of most people's well-being that it needs to be covered. It seems even more important than having a public educational system. Given these intuitions, the social liberal political system seems to be an as good as it gets system when it comes to possible political organizations. There are many challenges associated with it, but it's as good as it gets for the time being. The seventh point: classical transhumanism aims for immortality. Euro-transhumanism aims for an increased health span. There are many challenging concepts which get upheld by classical transhumanism. However, the concept of immortality is clearly among the weirdest. If mind uploading was actually a necessary element of transhumanism, which it is not, then I would understand why some intellectualists accuse transhumanism of merely being a new kind of religion, or of it not being a worldview which deserves to be taken seriously by scholars. Immortality, if understood and taken literally, just doesn't make any sense in a non-dualistic ontology of becoming whatsoever. If there is permanent change in this world, there's not even any kind of ontological stability which transcends any single moment. If cosmological accounts of the world get taken into consideration, then the absurdity of the concept of immortality becomes even clearer. There is no realistic way in which a person can survive a cosmological singularity. The word immortality works as an advertisement tool, however. It has the side effect that it undermines the intellectual credibility of the proponent. What is relevant indeed is the importance of an increased health span. Most people are in some way or other interested in living longer healthily. Health here has to be taken as an open concept. For some, health means to feel good. For others, health implies the realization of our functional purposes. And there are great arguments for both sides. However, when I stress the relevance of health, I do not limit the meaning of the word to a specific philosophical understanding. Health is in an extremely general sense is important for most people, and it's this insight which is enormously important. It also has a great amount of practical implications and should be taken seriously on the political level as well, more seriously than it's currently considered. The eighth point is classical transhumanism can be identified with a silicon-based transhumanism, which is focused on mind uploading. Euro-transhumanism can be associated with a carbonate-based transhumanism, which has realized that we've always been cyborgs, and it's highly unlikely that singularity is near. So many critics of transhumanism have highlighted that transhumanism is all about the longing of becoming immortals through mind uploading. I've already mentioned a few reasons why immortality is a concept which needs to be avoided. A similar issue applies to mind uploading, even though I cannot exclude the possibility that it will be possible sometime in the future. However, given current scientific insights, there is no indication whatsoever that silicon-based entities can have consciousness, self-consciousness, emotions, or intentionality. However, in order to be able that our personalities can actually be transferred to a silicon-based foundation, it has to be the case that they can be transferred without a loss. Hence, consciousness, self-consciousness, emotions, and intentionality would have to persist on a silicon-based foundation too. And there's no indication so far that this can be realized. This doesn't mean that it's impossible, but there's simply no good reason for thinking that it will be possible to realize this goal soon. However, this doesn't mean that there is a categorically dualistic ontological distinction between silicon-based and carbonate-based entities. Both exist in the sensually accessible realm. It's a matter of structuring which qualities can be realized. With the coming about of the capacity to think, speak, and reason, something significant has happened, and that took place about 300,000 years ago. A genetic mutation plus human interaction brought about what we call rationality nowadays. This is when human beings were realized. This upgrade has generated the coming into existence of human beings. And now it seems plausible that we ourselves can generate further upgrades. However, upgrading ourselves is nothing morally problematic. It's rather the basis of our existence. What needs to be considered is which directions are desirable. Still, there's no general response to this question. Again and again, we need to talk about, analyze, and reflect upon these issues in order to guarantee that the developments are in our interests. Point 9. Classical transhumanism is centrally concerned with the risks of superintelligence. Eurotranshumanism is doubtful concerning the coming about of artificial general intelligence as well as superintelligence in the near future. I don't underestimate the relevance of AI. Playing around with various AI tools is amazingly astonishing, and they're getting better day by day. I can already see why some of the developments which are likely to be available in the near future. However, this doesn't mean that embodied AIs will take over the world. The human AI interaction has an enormous amount of potential for being risky for existence. That's a different issue. We need to be enormously careful in this respect, so when it comes to the interaction with humans. But there's a fine but decisive difference between these two judgments. If consciousness, self-consciousness, emotions, and intentionality cannot be realized on a silicon basis, then it seems unlikely that embodied AIs will be able to say, I want this or that, and realize it. However, such a decision would have to be necessary for AI taking over, for AI putting humans into a zoo, and for AI controlling the entire universe. Such thoughts are great for utopian novels, sci-fi films, and Netflix series, but AI taking over by itself is not a realistic option so far. Challenging moral issues arise concerning AI-human interaction, and scary issues arise. However, this phenomenon is fundamentally different from AIs taking over by themselves. So again, always the fine differences really need to be considered. Point 10 is classical transhumanism is concerned with the overcoming of suffering. Eurotranshumanism recognizes the inevitability of suffering. In contrast to the former statement concerning dukkha, which was a descriptive one, here normative judgments get dealt with. Classical transhumanists claim that we should try to overcome suffering, as suffering undermines the capacity for living a good life. Should we actually do so? Suffering is a challenge. We don't like to suffer. However, it also needs to be realized that we all embrace suffering when it's meaningful suffering. When we know that what we suffer for, when we suffer to realize something which is important to us. Creating a sculpture, writing a book, or climbing onto the top of a mountain can be extremely meaningful activities for many humans. These activities can provide lives with a purpose, with meaning. They involve suffering, pain, and discomfort. However, the side effects get embraced because of the goals which are being aspired for. And suffering doesn't have to be a problematic issue. It's meaningless suffering which is so terrible. A second point needs to be considered too. If we imagine a life without suffering, the issue also needs to be addressed in how far pleasure can be experienced in such a world. So if an intense feeling of pain is not possible, how and why should the feeling of pleasure be possible still? This doesn't seem likely. The question then needs to be addressed whether life without pleasure and pain would indeed be a better one than the one with pleasures and pains. Buddhists might think that this is a desirable goal by identifying it with a peri-nirvana. I have my doubts in that respect. Point 11 is classical transhumanism sees itself in the tradition of the Enlightenment. Eurotranshumanism is highly critical of the logocentric Enlightenment tradition and stresses an ambiguous relationship with the philosophical foundations of the Enlightenment. And this point is particularly intriguing. What does the Enlightenment actually stand for? There are two strong traditions. Firstly, the logocentric tradition from Descartes to Kant, and secondly, the body-centric tradition from Marquis de Sade to Nietzsche. And both are clearly part of the Enlightenment tradition. Depending on our understanding of what enlightenment is, different ontological implications are given. According to the logocentric tradition, human beings consist of a physical body and an immaterial rational mind. Enlightenment here is about using reason to criticize traditional institutions, structures, and thoughts. According to the body-centric tradition, however, enlightenment is about undermining the universal validity of reason to realize that human beings are merely incredibly different from other animals, and that our rational mind is merely a part of our body. And the rationality is obviously then also not unified. And in this case, however, there's no longer one unified rational mind, but there are many minds and there are many bodies, and each rational mind is slightly different from the mind of another body. So classical transhumanists embrace the understanding proposed by the logocentric tradition of enlightenment that it's our task to use reason for realizing our goals. But at the same time, many of these transhumanists also affirm that they embrace a naturalist ontology. Such an ontology, however, rules out the possibility of categorically dualist ontology, as it's affirmed in the logocentric tradition from Descartes to Kant. Hence, they are contradicting themselves. Eurotranshumanism takes this insight seriously and embraces the understanding of an embodied mind. This leads them to highlight an ambiguous relationship with enlightenment. On the other hand, the use of reason is important, helpful, and relevant. On the one hand, the use of reason is important, helpful, and relevant. On the other hand, it becomes clear that reason can no longer provide us with fundamental insights concerning the nature of the world. If the mind is merely a part of the body, then it's plausible that all I can do is to somehow help us navigate through the world without there being the option of reason providing us an insight into the nature of the world. Finally, the 12th point was then the last but not least point concerning the comparison between classical transhumanism and Eurotranshumanism. Classical transhumanism denies that Nietzsche is an ancestor of transhumanism. Eurotranshumanism regards Nietzsche as an ancestor of transhumanism. So here in that last but not least, I'll mention a few additional points concerning the relevance of Nietzsche for transhumanism. I mean, there's a long-standing debate which was initially triggered by my Nietzsche and transhumanism article from 2009. There's an entire book which Jonas Tunchel edited. It's called Nietzsche and Transhumanism, which really collects all the central articles of the debate. And there were several times that, scholars wrote a response, I wrote a response to the responses, and so on and so on. A central reason for classical transhumanism to reject Nietzsche as an ancestor of transhumanism is that Nietzsche still has an enormously bad reputation, as he's widely seen as being intimately connected to the so-called Third Reich. In order to protect transhumanism from a bad reputation, classical transhumanism distances itself from getting associated with Nietzsche. And there are a few other reasons for doing so too, but the fear of classical transhumanists of getting a bad reputation for being associated with Nietzsche seems to be among the most dominant reasons for upholding this judgment. For Eurotranshumanism, as well as for informed scholars of Nietzsche's philosophy, it's entirely clear that Nietzsche is a good European, an anti-German, and an anti-Semite. In contrast to classical transhumanism, Eurotranshumanism draws heavily on reflections from Nietzsche, is deeply engaged with his reflection, and employs Nietzsche's thinking for developing further Eurotranshumanism. And there are many structural analogies between Nietzsche's philosophy and Eurotranshumanism. The following three insights seem to me of particular relevance. Firstly, Nietzsche highlights that the soul is merely a part of the body. So you've got that non-dualistic understanding, anthropology, but also ontology, an ontology of becoming. Secondly, Nietzsche's will to power ontology is becoming is a non-dualistic version of naturalism. Nietzsche's ontology of becoming can be seen as a reinterpretation of the ontology of becoming as it was presented by Heraclitus. And thus we enter a hermeneutic circle. So on that basis, perspectivism becomes the most plausible epistemology, which again leads to the interpretation that an ontology of becoming best explains the phenomena which we're confronted with. Thirdly, Nietzsche also highlights the relevance of the wisdom of the body, with all its idiosyncratic drives, wishes, and longings. And there's a lot more which could be said on this issue. So, but there, please look up the collection by Jonas Tunchel, Nietzsche and Transhumanism, which came out in 2017. So I see it is now half an hour has passed, so I'm right on time. My 12 points are over. Of course, there's lots more to be said, so I summarize the most important elements with respect to the comparison. And the main goal was to show, well, transhumanism is not just about trying to become immortal by realizing mind uploading, and then trying to, maximize the impact, bring about the best utilitarian consequences as it's presented in the classical transhumanism position. There are much more nuanced and philosophically informed approaches, and my Euro-transhumanism is one such approach. So I'm looking forward to the discussion and to hearing your thoughts on that issue.
Thank you, Stefan, very much. It was very interesting, and especially how you presented 12 different tensions of transhumanism. I have some questions, but I think that we have to start with our audience. So please, if there are any questions to start the discussion, we have, let's say, something like 20 minutes for our Q&A. So any questions are welcome. Yes, Dr. Lechman, please.
Thank you very much for this presentation. What I would like to ask is, you did not highlight the use of transhumanism to have some advantage over others that do not have access to the same technology, and also the use of the technology to increase the gap between disadvantages and advantages. So it was kind of optimistic approach to transhumanism, and you did not speak, at least I have not heard that, how it might be very bad for humanity.
So I don't think it's bad for humanity. It's a wrong application of technology which can have terrible consequences. So it is not transhumanism which is a problem. It is actually mainly the political circumstances which are challenging. So and of course, you know, this was a summary of 12 points. But sort of when the political I hinted at, and actually a long article on politics is now coming out in a collection which is being edited by James Hughes, another leading transhumanist in a collection by Dick Reuter coming out later this year. However, no, you're right. So you're right. The political is a highly challenging issue. And when I talked about the point comparing classical transhumanism being basically libertarian, this is and this really leads to sort of the gap between the haves. If become dominant with classical transhumanism, actually, it can have extremely problematic implications. So the gap between the rich and the poor widens even further, which I guess could even, could lead to issues like civil war and further challenging situations. That's one of the reasons why I strongly stress the highlight of Eurotranshumanism. By the way, Eurotranshumanism is not a Eurocentric perspective. I'm not affirming sort of a European supremacy or anything. Eurotranshumanism merely stresses, well, I'm revealing my cultural embeddedness because this is a background from which I argue, at the same time aware because of the perspectives and whatever I present is an interpretation, and I could be completely wrong. But in the same way as every other stance could be entirely wrong. So that's why, just to relativize, just to explain, lay open the backgrounds on which I argue. But as a consequence here, concerning that issue, stuff like social justice, global justice issue do become pressing. And why I stress that I'm not so, while there are good reasons for not being pessimistic, one needs to see the global developments just in a historical perspective. Just if you look back 200 years time, 200 years time on a global scale, we had an average life expectancy of 40 years. Now we've got a life expectancy of 80 years. Even in a country like let's say Nigeria, I looked that up, it was higher than 60 years. So even in lesser developed countries, the quality of lives is significantly higher than it was without all these technological developments which have taken place in the past 200 years. So that is a significant process. Of course, we're not living in a perfect situation, and there's a lot of global justice issues which need to be dealt with. However, we already see a lot of important movements into the right direction. And a further issue, which again, it's another study which I've taken from I've taken from our world in data from this Oxford University website. Max Rosa was responsible, for putting together the project. Was enormous amount of data, and basically what came out as part of these surveys was, if you look at something like absolute poverty, 200 years ago we had an absolute poverty rate globally of more than 90%. Even in more developed countries like England, we had an absolute poverty rate of more than 80%. And I'm talking of absolute, not of relative poverty. Absolute poverty meaning, there are people, have nothing, no shelter, no food to eat, really daily struggles to survive. And if we look at the developments which have taken place now in the past 200 years, we can actually see, and I'm asking that regularly to my students, to the audience, and I'm wondering sort of what do you think how these things have changed the poverty rates in the past 200 years? Now the absolute poverty rate globally is down to 10%. And of course, there are still too many people suffering, and it's terrible if that's the case. But being down from more than 90 to 10%, that's already a move into the right direction. But of course, you're right. We need to take these things seriously. It's not sort of a necessity that these things will get better, but reflected on and dealt with the various possibilities how to respond to global justice issues. There doesn't seem to be a better, as good as it gets solution than by innovating and realizing new technologies and trying our best to make them accessible in all parts of the world.
Thank you so much, Stefan, for your response. There is one more question from Mita Gadulu Diomo. Please, like to ask your question?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stefan, for your talk. I'm a Cameroonian philosopher. I'm currently in Cameroon, and I'm interested in transhumanism from my work I've done at Harvard University a couple of years ago. So I'm definitely from an emerging, so-called emerging country, so it might seem very far from us. But I think it's not that far, but we may discuss this later. I just wanted you to say a little bit more about the fact that it seemed to me, if I got you well, it seemed to me that you're opposing classical transhumanism to Euro transhumanism, especially by looking at the theoretical perspectives or the theoretical standpoints and the kind of utopias nurturing those two approaches to transhumanism. But it wasn't really clear to me, and you mentioned it by looking at the major proponents of transhumanism, why classical transhumanism will oppose European transhumanism. In my opinion, most of these proponents of even classical transhumanism are either European or from European descent. So it wasn't really clear to me how you construct the opposition between classical and Euro.
Okay, the classical transhumanism, sort of the points I highlighted with respect, utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is clearly as part of that's dominant in the Anglo-American world, with all the various implications. And you can see the various proponents who've, Oxford has been a stronghold, but just even if the people were not from the Anglo-American world, it's a culture of thinking what I'm talking about. So and the culture of thinking represents like a utilitarian standpoint, represents the goal, mind uploading. It's the goal of the most important further development is a digital further development. So with the possibility of mind uploading and singularity to occur within 20, 30 years time. This is sort of what they're mainly focused about. However, that's a silicon-based transhumanism. So in the continental European, it's more a carbonate-based further development. It's more about genetic modification. It's about using using data, digital data, but in order to promote promote, understand correlations between genes and diseases and so on, in order to develop these types of, from bioprinting to selecting genes after selecting fertilized eggs after IVF and PGD, genetic modification. These issues are more promising, are more likely. Undoing aging means to increase the health span as a central goal. So there is a quite a difference between the theoretical approach, and that's sort of the theoretical, and who you're dealing with, who are the sort of the strong points of reference in your cultural background. And that's also something why sort of in the European approach. So within the debates, there are actually not so many people in the Anglo-American world dealing with transhumanism who strongly draw upon, who are even strongly familiar with people like, you know, like Nietzsche, Spinoza, and like going back to Heraclitus and ancient and Greek, and so by drawing upon these, and that's important also when I talk about European Euro-transhumanism. It's not a way, it's not Eurocentric, because it clearly, it's just I'm highlighting this is my cultural situatedness, and I'm just laying these things open. And by laying things open and by embracing perspectivism, so what I'm presenting is also just an interpretation, and could be false, basically means I'm entering into a debate. I don't know whether I've got something important to tell you, but maybe I do. So I'm presenting these outlines, and maybe there's a resonance from your side, and you see, well, that's a good point, and then we enter a debate, and we develop something further. And I've actually worked quite a bit with I've had an event on transhumanism in Africa together with Leo Igwe from Nigeria, Jokwu from Nigeria. We've cooperated a lot. There was an event on transhumanism in Africa, and also a journal on transhumanism in South Africa, which was launched. And at that event, I also participated, and also sort of strongly highlighted and thought the relevance of taking global justice issues more strongly into consideration. That's something which I think, in particular, if you look at you know, again, what happened in Oxford for a while. The long-termism thinking, that has some really problematic implications. That could even, you know, mean that could mean, you know, as long as the traditional elite, rich elite survives, then this is fine in the long run, even if the rest of the world dies. And so there are so many discriminatory factors which are being implied in that stance. And that's why, you know, this is not, and that's why I'm really strong on highlighting, no, this is nothing which I want to have anything to do with. That's why the Euro-transhumanist, it's a completely different approach. It does not affirm these discriminations. That has to do with sort of a more, the classical transhumanist approach. And I'm trying to show, and even critics from critical posthumanism, from some sort of more leftist French understanding, who often are very critical of transhumanism. I'm showing, no, well, I'm making a bridge. I'm building a bridge in between thinking, and I've embraced a lot of aspects from the European cultural tradition, which they have done so too. But I don't think, with respect to the political insight, I think I'm extremely critical of sort of critical posthumanists, because they want to move away in the end from a liberal democracy, and that's when I think things are becoming really dangerous, because by moving away from a liberal democracy, then paternalistic structures, totalitarian structures get implemented, and I find that, and this is one thing I've learned from my German background. This really needs to be avoided. That's why I react extremely strongly to such suggestions. Well, of course, what I said now here was like really condensed what I presented elsewhere within a long argument. I hope that clarifies a couple of issues.
Thank you, Stefan. There is a very interesting question. I think two questions in the chat. From the first one and thank you for both questions, from Tamara Kamatovic. I'd like to say a few words about your question. Would like to read it. There is a question, actually a very interesting one, from Tamara Kamatovic, life expectancy in many developed countries where technologies are being patented is going down. Can technology solve this? Actually, this is the first question.
Yeah, that's true. It's true. That's happened recently. That's sort of a very, very recent development. I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether it's sort of the connection between patenting and life expectancy going down. And there's a strong correlation between these two issues. It rather seems to me, so they've usually been, in particular when times of a crisis, of the of wars, of COVID crisis, that this is rather related to the issue of life expectancies going down. But it needs to be studied further where the correlations, where the plausible correlations actually apply, or whether it's just a sort of a going down moment which has happened as a consequence of recent events. I don't think it is the issue of being patented. So the patent, but the patent question is absolutely fascinating and is really central. And I would love to. I would, maybe I can say a few words at least. I mean, so having a patent means, so patent is an intellectual property. An intellectual property, and you can get a patent on something if you develop something which is new, which is non-obvious, and which is useful. So innovative, non-obvious, and useful. These three criteria need to apply. And then you in the US get the exclusive right of use for 20 years of that intellectual property. And we've seen sort of the implications of that. What it has during the COVID pandemic. During the COVID pandemic, we developed vaccines which worked enormously well within less than a year, and I'm absolutely thrilled and fascinated by that having happened. So they have got the exclusive right of usage to decide who develops BioNTech, let's say. And at the other hand, we were in a situation of crisis because there were millions of people dying who did not have access to the vaccination in time, because BioNTech didn't allow it to produce in certain African countries. They claimed, I think it was the reason was because of the quality of the producers couldn't guarantee the quality of the vaccine. However, another issue might have been that they weren't able to pay enough, basically, because they owned the patent concerning the COVID vaccine. And they've put in a lot of effort to, great minds to produce something amazing within a short period of time. And they did realize it. Other pharmaceutical companies who did the same, who worked on the same mechanism, had a success rate for the COVID vaccine, which was like 30-40%, not good enough. And that has a consequence, the company went bankrupt. So it's extremely risky. You need a lot of money, you need a lot of investment in order to realize a drug, to successfully realize a drug. And because the situation was such an exceptional one, the issue came up, well, shouldn't we waive the patent right for utilitarian reasons? Because with the situation of crisis, and millions of people could be saved if now more of the COVID vaccine were produced in other places, parts of the world. Places which were not granted the right to produce the drug. And there seems to be a strong inclination to say so, to affirm that, because it's about human lives, no? And the others, it's about making money. On the other hand, it is, you need investments. You need investments in order to create the drugs. You need venture capitalists. You need people who put in a lot of money in risk, and they could lose everything. And would they do so if the right of patents was undermined, was waived for a certain period of time. That might have long-term serious consequences. And the money is needed for these new, in particular, the radical developments. And so I'm actually, I'm highlighting the tension here between sort of, patent rights and waiving patent rights in certain situations, being fully aware of the tragic, terrible consequences upholding patent rights in these contexts. And so I see the challenges with the patents. I would, it's difficult for me to say so, but even in these circumstances, or everything connected, and sort of keeping up the relevance of innovation, keeping up the relevance of people risking their money in order to develop new drugs, is so important that undermining patent rights might actually stop that. So that's why I think upholding patent rights is really important. However, one could say, well, couldn't the same thing be done by political institutions? Political institutions doing the investing in developments of drugs. The problem, and I would hope that could be an option. Knowing political institutions, democratic, liberal democratic, social liberal democratic institutions, I'm aware that they're very careful with the taxpayers' money. They don't want to waste it, and that's why they invest in research which is safer, which is not as risky. And so the openness, the willingness of political institutions to invest in the groundbreaking technologies is not very high. So I wish that was the case. In that case, one would have to rethink the issue of patents. If the situation is as it is now, it seems to be sort of having investors is an important issue. But it's an open debate. It really is an open debate, and that's why I sort of try to highlight the tension. But sort of the question is spot on, and the question concerning patents is an extremely challenging and extremely difficult one, because upholding could mean that millions of people's lives are actually being, people die as a consequence, and that's just tragic and terrible. But we need to make sure that new innovative drugs get developed. So, so given the current situations, I've still some sort of tendency, at least, to think, well, that is so important. Patent rights are important. But maybe by developing the appropriate political institutions to find a different way of financing such stuff within outside of a more libertarian system, and most of the new drugs are developed in the United States because the money is there and because their venture capitalists are willing to invest it. And I wish it was different. And I wish that could take place in a social liberal democratic background, like in a European EU state country. But some more radical rethinking would have to take place in order to consider the possibility. So as you can see, I'm struggling with the question. I'm really in between. I see the advantages, but the patent question is really spot on, and a lot of further thought needs to go into that. And then we would have to have at least an entire week of discussions in order to get into the details of that problem.
Yes, yeah. Stefan, and just to note that we have one more question. We have
sure.
And just a clarification from Tamara Kamato, which is that I'm reading message. I did not mean to imply that patenting is the cause of life expectancy going down. Only that in countries where new biotechnologies are being developed, they are not being used on the broader population, is what actually you mentioned also earlier. This is to support the argument that there are political obstacles to the Euro-transhumanist ideal. And I think this is a very good point actually in this. And of course, it's a philosophical discussion and open to this additional criticism. And since we have only 5 minutes, just to read from Dr. Lehman, I think there's an additional question. Is transhumanism limited to an aspect of longevity? And if so, modern agriculture and nutrition has been a major contribution to longevity. There are many other aspects of transhumanism which relates to the future of humanity, with opportunities and risks apart from political implications. I think also this has been covered, but I don't know if you want to add something on longevity and transhumanism in these terms.
There are many other aspects to transhumanism which relate to the future of humanity. Yes, yeah, I agree. Obviously, there are many other issues. I was now focusing a lot on increased health span because because of what I said about the concept of the good life. So in contrast to classical transhumanism, which paints a picture, well, we all need to have, we all need to affirm the standard account of the good, like the Vitruvian man being realized, turned into a hyper Vitruvian man by means of emerging technologies. And so, stronger, faster, higher, more memory, longer lives, and so on, more intelligence, more cognitive capacities, and so on. Because of that, the prevalence of that account of the good in classical transhumanism, there are many other factors. But in the account I'm presenting, I affirm a radical plurality of concepts of a good life. I think there's not one aspect, not one element concerning the good life which applies to all persons. We all are so radically different from each other that there's not one element which applies to all. However, I'm aware, and I highly stress, sort of the importance of an increased health span is relevant for more than 90%, for a great percentage of persons. Be it because health is of intrinsic relevance, maybe it's just of instrumental relevance. And it could include a notion of health, which is, I'm healthy if I feel fine. It could include a notion of the health, which is functional, if all my bodily functions exist, if I work properly. So I'm open. It's a very, very broad, it's a very vague understanding of health, which I'm drawing upon. And there I'm saying, look, that at least appeals to the great amount of people, but even there it doesn't apply to all people, that it's actually beneficial for living the good life. And that's why I highlighted the issue of longevity. But of course, it's correct. So you shouldn't limit everything just to the issue of longevity. There have been many other groundbreaking issues. If you look back before the 20th century, just imagine a life. If you don't have a hairdryer, if you don't have a fridge, if you don't have a central heating, if you don't have a coffee machine, if you don't have imagine what you can't store the milk and put that back in the fridge. You can't dry your hair. You're getting a cold all the time. You don't have that. You don't just turn on the heating and everything's fine. So, of course, just to stress, these are might be some banal elements, some banal examples, but they actually make a difference. And, many of these things have only become available to wider populations in the 20th century, or they didn't even exist before the 20th century. So that's why I think, it is extremely important to keep these things in mind. Anesthetics, if you go to, but that's related to health again, but still anesthetics, imagine going to the dentist without having the possibility of anesthesia. Kissing in the 15th century was not as sweet and pleasurable as it might be nowadays. No. So yes. So there are many other factors which I didn't talk about. I highlighted the issue of the increased health span because I think that's the one thing which most people share when it comes to the question of the quality of life.
Stefan, thank you very much. Actually, we have just a couple of minutes already, 9 o'clock Athens time. I think that there are many challenges, and for me, actually, the political challenges which have been discussed is indeed a momentum where AI democratic challenges with transhumanism seems to be connected, and you mentioned several times the political and social challenges. I think there are also some terminological challenges where you have this distinction between classical and Euro-transhumanism. It's like reconsidering the single and unified term transhumanism. And what means to be transhuman with this divergent world? I think that perhaps there is also an issue of what terms are we going to use to describe the cultural, sensitive, and individual aspects of all these understandings. I know that the topic is huge, and hope we are going to repeat this discussion not only in Rome and Athens. And I would like, and on behalf of the Institute of Philosophy and Technology here in Athens, very much for this honor and privilege to enlighten us with this knowledge and reflect on the question of post-humanism, and with the different critical, optimistic, but also pessimistic aspects that entails this discussion. Thank you very much all for your participation and for joining us tonight. And thank you again, Stefan, for this privilege.
Many thanks for your kind remarks. It was a great pleasure being here with you. I'm looking forward to future discussions. Obviously, each minute issues, how to deal with digital data, who has access to them. That's again another discussion. And then 1 hour on that topic wouldn't be sufficient. So, it's a big topic because it's related to fundamental paradigm shift, the post-human paradigm shift, where we're moving from sort of that essentialist understanding of who we are as humans, with a categorically dualist ontology towards a non-dualist ontology of becoming. And so all the certainties, all the encrusted structures which might still be dominant have lost their impact or their plausibility, and we need to rethink all aspects of our way of lives. And so the best minds of our generations are needed to do so. So I'm looking forward to the further discussions and engagements and exchanges on that issue. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Have a great evening. Goodbye from Athens.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thank you. It was a great evening.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
You will see there